Doctor Strangelove, one of the most iconic anti-war films ever made, I would say, and probably the best satire on the Cold War that I've ever seen made, especially given that I have recently, I think I mentioned this in the last one as well, been watching through Academic Agent's excellent Reviewing Adam Curtis series, and there is one episode on that where he talks about the rational means by which the Americans and the US were discussing fighting the Cold War if it ever came to a nuclear exchange. Because really, this film is maybe about 90% as absurd as the actual real-life situation.
Oh, totally. Like, when I was watching esteemed elite theory scholar and Blaze Jim avoider Nima Parvini's coverage of that, I just thought, this is Strangelove, and even the same people are citing about it. Was it Helmut Kahn and Werner von Braun are referenced in the material, and the Rand Corporation comes up a lot in Kubrick's research, and very much like another oddity, Airplane. Doctor Strangelove is a case of something being based on a completely serious script and then someone realising, no, hang on, there's a comedy in this. This is pure farce. I
think it would probably be writing a line that says, "You're not supposed to be fighting in the war room." That would probably make it click
What
in
are you
your mind.
doing, gentlemen? No fighting in here, this is the war room.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here, this is the war room.
There you go.
He's going to see the big board. There's lots of quotable lines in this film, and George C. Scott, despite being a very serious and down-to-earth actor, gives a perfect absurdist performance, which I actually think in some ways outstrips Peter Sellers. Even though Peter Sellers does give 3 great performances in this film, I thought George C. Scott, purely for the scene where he's trying to point at the big board and say, "We can't let them see the big board," and literally trips up over himself, does a roly-poly, and gets back up on his feet in one smooth movement.
It is not a thing a sane man would do. The doomsday machine is designed to trigger itself automatically.
But surely you can disarm it somehow?
No, it is designed to explode if any attempt is ever made to untrigger it.
Automatically?
It's an obvious commie trick, Mr. President. We're wasting valuable time. Look at the big board. They're getting ready to clobber us.
Which was supposedly an accident on set that Kubrick left in because it was so funny. That alone outdoes it. Even if, yes, at the end, Dr. Strangelove is fighting with his disembodied Nazi hand, which is desperately trying to choke him out for helping the Americans and the Russians.
So I have a bit of a controversial opinion on this film. So I think it works much, much better as a comedy than it does an anti-war film or a parody of the Cold War. I actually think the criticism of nuclear deterrence is a bit silly because they did work. And also the rationale behind it of, well, you make an attack so, the retaliation to an attack so punishing that there's no reason to want to attack. That's a good rationale. And sure, you can quibble about the logistics of it, but I felt like it was a little bit bleeding heart. Not to sound too cold. I'm not, the next Doctor Strangelove or anything, but yeah, I felt like it didn't necessarily age well. Now we know how the Cold War ended up, and I think it may play into Kubrick's paranoia about the likelihood of nuclear war, that he saw everyone involved as incompetent, but also the logic of a nuclear conflict is that even if the Russians launched lots of missiles, it doesn't even necessarily make sense to retaliate because you're going to be dead anyway. It doesn't really matter. It's better to kind of have a leap of faith and know that perhaps it's just I can tell you want to say something.
Finish the statement.
It would be better to just hope that it was a machine error and they were not really an attack, because if all life on Earth disappears, then there's really no point. It's just out of spite. And of course the film is about the egos of the men involved, but that more plays into the comedy than an actual criticism of the behaviour in the Cold War, because many of the people who were actually involved weren't necessarily like that at all. But sorry, do go ahead.
I'm going to have to disagree with your take here, Josh, because sadly I think that you are approaching it from a bit of a too rationalistic perspective on the motivations and thought processes of the people involved in the actual Cold War at the time that Kubrick was doing all of this. Because interestingly enough, the Adam Curtis documentary that AA talks about and watches talks about how the planners behind all of the measures for mutually assured destruction were all going off of a very, very strict idea of game theory, and they were expecting to be able to plan out and predict their opponent's moves with pinpoint precision based on the assumption that they would make the most rational choice available to them. And like in the situation that's presented in Doctor Strangelove, this completely ignores the fact that people don't always take the most rational course of action. Human ego, human emotion has a much bigger part to play. So, for instance, in the documentary, Curtis cuts to an interview with one of these planners where they said that if there was this idea that if there was ever an accidental nuclear exchange where somebody went crazy or there was a technical malfunction that meant that a Russian city got nuked, that the first thing that they would do is get on the phone to the Russians, explain to them calmly what had happened, and then basically offer up an equivalent American city.
Detroit.
That was very quick.
We'll do it anyway.
You can't stop me. We've got to get rid of it. They would offer up an equivalent American city to nuke in response to make everything even. But of course that's not how things actually happen. When it came to brass tacks and you get the Cuban Missile Crisis, all of a sudden out of nowhere, the game theory planners were all saying, Mr. Kennedy, right, Mr. President, you need to get on the phone to Soviet Russia, you need to speak to the Kremlin, tell them that we'll do this in response to this and this in response to this. And Kennedy threw all of that aside and said, no, shut up. The men are in the room now, the people who actually make the decisions are making the decisions. And Kennedy said, point all of your nukes at the Kremlin and Russia and say, if you do anything in Cuba, we will fire everything we have at you and wipe you off the face of the earth. Because if you're facing pure destruction, it's not a question of, well, I'll be dead anyway, so who cares? It's a question of, well, if you're going to wipe me off the face of the earth, then I'm going to make sure that even if I'm dead, you're wiped off the face of the earth. And I think that is part of what Kubrick is satirizing here, that the best laid plans of mice and men will eventually come down to the American president trying desperately to tell the drunk Russian Kremlin, I think he's drunk, sir.
And how did things work out for Kennedy exactly?
Well, he got assassinated by question mark. I won't fill in.
Yeah, and my rebuttal here would be that there are lots of people in that chain of command that would have stopped it, and of course Kubrick consulted with the actual people involved in this. And they said, well, we have things in place that will prevent the situation in your film from happening, which is actually part of the screen that comes up.
There's something else that came from this as well, which was that this film led to congressional hearings where they said, oh, wait, actually, we don't have all of the safeguards in place to prevent this exact situation from happening. Particularly the thing that I saw people talking about was the fact that when one of Peter Sellers' characters, I think
Merkin
Muffley, when Muffley is trying to get through to the president and doesn't have the change for the payphone.
That's one of the funniest parts of the song.
Supposedly, Congress said, actually, this might be a problem. If something like this happens and somebody needs to get through to the president or to the right people, how are we going to stop? Are they able to get through as easily as they should be able to? Are they going to have to shoot open a Coca-Cola machine and violate the private property rights of the Coca-Cola Corporation? Is this a real problem? So this did lead to congressional hearings where they changed US policy on this. So you can't really say that it wasn't in some ways effective at doing what it set out to do, which is warn people that there is some real danger here.
But reforming telephone policy in bases is very different from the entire philosophy of mutually assured destruction.
Okay, but the policy of mutually assured destruction, once again, is based off of the idea that people are making the best rational decision that they have available to them, and the worry was that if somebody did go rogue, and the kind of situation that arises happens, are you going to be able to get to somebody who spoke about it? Yeah, it didn't happen, but that's like...
If I may, if you study risk management, which I can't recommend, guys, they come up with, there's a couple of cases that they typically throw at you. One is about a screen malfunction showing an American serviceman that a bunch of Russian missiles were heading towards them, and therefore you need to follow the procedure. And it was that American disobeying procedure, using his own judgment, that saved the day. The other one is a bear breaking into an airport. Do look it up, it's very fun. And again, it's someone breaking the procedure. And I think that's something Kubrick harks on, because as we sort of covered when we discussed The Killing, this is a theme that Kubrick's going to go to again and again, which is about uber-rational systems not breaking down, distrusting authority, kind of not handing over your power to those systems because you can't trust them. That's something he's going to go to again and again, and obviously the next film we'll discuss is maybe the best example of this.
But my sort of point of contention, I think, is that the film is sort of a cautionary tale in people following their sort of mission directive to the point of suicide, right? And I think that the evidence of
the beefy,
of course, yeah, that's what I have in mind, right? Yeah. And you could also say that the people on the base ordered by that general, like they see the US soldiers and just say, oh, that looks very authentic. Oh well, maybe they got it in the army surplus. It's explained away. Right. Yeah, it is. But as you said, in real life, people don't necessarily just behave in that way like machines. They're well aware. They are, a bit more rational about the threat and their involvement in it than it would assume. And you have the case of that Russian submarine commander as well, where he chose to ignore the signal to fire his payload because he sort of took it as an article of faith that, well, maybe it's a machine error, and even if it's not, well, it doesn't really matter. And so that's my perspective on it, is that, yeah, actually Kubrick was being a bit, I think his over-egging of the dangers of it was a bit much, and I think it was because he was right in the midst of it, right? It was the mid-60s, it was the closest time that people came to nuclear war, that's for certain. But also the nuclear deterrent thing is probably the only reason we didn't go to, the West didn't go to war with the Soviet Union, which eventually collapsed. So it did all work out in the end.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.